And so why that matters, John Adams, you mentioned this last week as well on the previous episode, that he had mentioned that our Constitution is made only for a moral and a religious people and is wholly inadequate for any other. His point was not that government should coerce faith. His point was that our form of government presupposes a sort of self-governance where people restrain themselves through their conscience, through virtue and moral formation. But what informs your conscience and your concept of virtue and your moral formation? How do we maintain a quote-unquote moral people, as Adams described, when we can't even agree on what morality is?
As I often do, I come back to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain rights. And government's job is to enforce those rights and not to infringe upon them. That right there is the unity. So, it doesn't matter to me what part of the world you come from, as long as you are willing to agree with that principle, the principles within that phrase, there's several principles within that phrase we talked about before, then you can assimilate perfectly well within America. Unfortunately, people born in America the last few generations, that whole concept has been undermined, especially the universities tried to undermine that whole concept, which has led to a weakness in our country. Because with that phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Both sides, again, care about equality, and it's right there in the Declaration of Independence.
Political thinkers, going all the way back to Aristotle, all the way up to the present, have warned that a republic struggles to survive if it becomes just a geographic space that's inhabited by a bunch of competing tribes with no shared moral language. There's these two models. One is the melting pot. When we talk about a melting pot, it's assimilation. That is e pluribus unum, out of many one, where newcomers adopt the national language, they adopt the core political values, and the primary civic loyalty that comes with being an American. The other model is what you might call the salad bowl. That's multiculturalism. Out of many, many. E pluribus pluribus. Groups coexist, but they retain their own distinct and competing identities and have very little in terms of a unifying creed. That is what we've actually promoted in recent years in the United States. And the United States are becoming less and less united as a result of it.
I mean, no country, no organization of any kind can really survive if you don't have a unifying principle that unifies the organization or the nation. And it goes for any business, it goes for military. You all need to be striving towards a common goal, having a common mission. So that's what we're trying to get back to, is kind of help ourselves think and clarify what those principles are, and help others to think as well, and try to bring people back to a consensus that makes us strong.
In this government, in this free society where anybody can say what they want, even from the pulpit, do we not run the risk of people and religions that we might disagree with saying things and influencing public policy? The short answer is yes, you absolutely run that risk. It's part of what Jefferson called a dangerous freedom that we get to enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of Fire for Effect, episode 27. We're recording this on January 23rd, Friday, here with James McBride, and I'm Marcus Moyer. How you doing, Jim?
Doing well. Looking forward to getting into pulling some threads, kind of based on our last episode. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, me too. Last week's episode sparked a lot of interest from some of the listeners and the viewers on the various platforms that we post this on. And for those who weren't able to be with us last week we examined the modern, what we call the modern myth of the separation of church and state. And we argued that the popular modern meaning that has been given to that phrase is actually a reversal of the founders' original intent. The founders' aim, as we attempted to establish last week, the founders' aim was to restrain government, prevent government intrusion into the church, not to ban religious influence from public life. The First Amendment restrains Congress, not citizens, not churches. It doesn't restrict moral speech. However, in the early part of the 20th century, courts began shifting their interpretation of the First Amendment and what they understood to be separation of church and state. They started shifting from a protection model to an exclusion model. Rather than protecting religious liberties, they started restricting them. And if people want the Constitution to mean something other than what it says, that was the whole point of last week's episode, is what does the Constitution actually say? What does the First Amendment actually say? Not the meaning we've given to it in recent years and decades, but what does it actually say, and what did the founders originally mean for it to communicate? If the people want the Constitution to say or mean something different, there's a legitimate process to amend it. What should not happen, though, is judicial activism, creative interpretation that changes the text without the consent of the governed, which Jefferson, as we mentioned last week, said that we should return to that original intent, not try to see what meaning can be squeezed out of the existing text or what claims can be made against it. Our position last week, and it remains so this week, is aligned with Chief Justice or Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. He said that the Constitution is not a living organism. As we talked about last week, that's been the new trend, the new fad, if you will, for the legal system to treat the Constitution as a living Constitution rather than interpret it through its original intent. Justice Scalia said that the Constitution is not a living organism. It is a legal document. It says what it says, and it doesn't say what it doesn't say. And we subscribe to that view. We heard some very good and thoughtful questions from listeners and viewers on YouTube and other platforms that we post on, and we appreciate it. We appreciated that engagement, that thoughtful and respectful engagement of different ideas. Not everybody agrees with us, believe it or not. So we heard some good and thoughtful questions from viewers. It's exactly the kind of serious conversation that we hope to encourage always through the content of these episodes. One listener in Arkansas, for example, asked us or made the observation, if the founders didn't mean to keep religion out of government and the public square, what happens when someone is outspoken about a different religion, like Islam, for example? If that were suppressed, wouldn't that essentially make Christianity the state religion? That was this guy's question. Another viewer on YouTube raised a similar objection. He said, if there is no separation of church and state, then church income and property should be taxed. If churches stay out of politics, then fine, no tax. But if they play in politics, they should pay. Otherwise, they have an unfair advantage. That particular viewer also went on to say, where does it stop? What about Muslim influence? Would we support the Shahada in public schools or Sharia law if a majority wanted to implement that? So again, good discussion, which we encourage and we appreciate. And it was good to interact with folks on last week's episode. These questions I think they're fair questions. They're good questions. And the taxation argument especially leads directly to what we want to talk about today. We mentioned it briefly last week, but this week we're going to take a deeper look at it, and that is the Johnson Amendment. We mentioned it last week, but we didn't really unpack it. So that's what we want to talk about this week. Jim, any comments before we jump into that?
Yeah, just to reinforce a little bit of what you said, some of the comments, I think it was on YouTube. And before I get into that really quick, again, a reminder to everybody that this is a listener first podcast, but if you are able to watch it on either YouTube, Spotify, or Substack, we almost always every episode put in a lot of visual references and visual aids to make what we're saying even more clear. And you get to see our pretty faces. But so one of the things that from the one of the questions from one of the listeners on YouTube, we read those comments, and it actually made me think. Like I think in hindsight, I would have changed the title of that last episode, because it made me think that it's not that that Jefferson or other founders didn't intend for there to be a wall at all. It's just that Jefferson meant, and we agree with this, that the wall is keeping the government out of the church, vice church and faith being freely expressed within government. So there is a wall, but it's only a one-way wall. That was the intention. That's the way I articulate it in a way that makes a lot more sense. And that's because of a listener making a comment. It made me really think about it. So that's the value of engaging with our audience. So the Johnson Amendment, like you said, you brought that up towards the end, and we didn't really get into it, but it's related to our last episode 26. So please go watch that or listen to that before this one, because it'll tie in nicely to this discussion today.
Yep. So the last week's episode was entitled "The Wall That Never Existed," and to Jim's point, these conversations, our views and opinions can evolve too. Believe it or not, we've been wrong in the past. I don't think we're wrong in this case, but that's the value of talking to people who have other opinions and other viewpoints. I struggle with the one-way wall analogy because I don't have a concept of a one-way wall. Every wall has two sides. So in my mind, it seems more like the original intent was a one-way check valve. Hearkening back to my days as a pilot.
And maybe the founders didn't have check valves back then.
Yeah,
maybe the founders didn't have check valves back then. So Jefferson was struggling with an analogy or a descriptive term. But yeah, that's a more accurate.
So there's definitely a barrier there, but it's designed to prevent flow in one direction only. And it's a flow of power. That's the thing that's being checked in this one-way check valve. And as we'll see in a second, I think if we do our job today and make our case, that the way things are currently interpreted, since the courts have moved from this protective model to a restrictive model or an exclusion model in some cases, the power is flowing in one way and it's in the wrong direction. I would argue. But before we go down that road, I think it's important to make three clarifications. First, we are not arguing for a theocracy. That's not the point of this. We're not arguing that churches should run political parties. We don't agree with that either. And we're not arguing that pastors should become campaign managers. That's not the intent either. We are arguing, though, that moral speech should not be policed by the IRS or by the government in general, and that tying religious liberty to a tax status gives the government leverage over churches, leverage that history has shown, as we will demonstrate, can be used selectively as a political weapon. Most online arguments collapse everything into one word that is the the operative word in this discussion is politics. When you say that the church should not be involved in politics, we have to first define what politics is. And often that distinction, that description, that definition is missing in the online discussions and arguments. It was actually missing in the discussion we were having with this one listener on YouTube who had the opinion that the church should not be involved in politics. But we asked for a clarification of, well, what do you mean when you say politics? We never did get an answer to that question, but it's critical. It's the pivot point of the entire conversation. So defining the term. When we say politics, are we talking about issue advocacy, or in the case of churches, preaching about particular issues, biblical application to life, we might say? Or are we talking about civic engagement, voter registration, nonpartisan voter guides, and that sort of thing? Or are we talking about lobbying specific legislation? Or are we talking about endorsing a candidate explicitly, or opposing a candidate explicitly? Or are we just concerned about how campaign finance is run, talking about donating money from a church to a campaign or providing some kind of an in-kind contribution? So when someone says that churches should stay out of politics, which category of those 5 things that I just listed off there, which category do they mean that churches should stay out of? Where the government is concerned, where the Johnson Amendment is concerned, it really only restricts activity in the last 2 categories that I listed there, which is endorsing candidates and providing donations, fundraising, or in-kind contributions. And even the IRS's position has changed a little bit on that in just the last couple of years. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but to keep it grounded, we'll just let the Johnson Amendment itself define the line of what constitutes politics, where the church, or really any 501c3 tax-exempt organization is concerned. Title 26, the Internal Revenue Code, Section 501c3, which is where we get that term, a 501c3 organization, is where we find the wording of the Johnson Amendment. Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code says that qualifying organizations may not participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. And we'll put the exact wording from Title 26 on the screen here so everybody can read it for themselves. As we always say, we encourage you not to take our word for anything that we say. Go read it, for yourself. But notice, if you will, what the Johnson Amendment does not say. It does not say that these organizations cannot speak to certain issues. It never mentions sermons. It doesn't address theology. It doesn't restrict moral teaching or discussion of public policy as such. So what the Johnson Amendment is, it was passed in 1954. It was authored and sponsored by then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, and it was added to the tax code with very little debate. It applies to all 501c3 organizations, not just churches. So any charities, universities, all fall under this 501c3 provision. And it specifically prohibits endorsing or opposing political candidates. Crucially, it did not, and I think there's confusion here, the Johnson Amendment did not create church tax exemption. Churches were already generally exempt from taxes prior to 1954, going well back into our history. What the Johnson Amendment did, though, is it added a condition to a tax-exempt status that the churches already enjoyed. So there was already an arrangement where churches didn't pay taxes, but the Johnson Amendment put a restriction on that. In order to retain that privilege, there were certain conditions. It created kind of a vague, selectively enforced speech restriction one that can function less like a neutral rule of law and more like a pressure tool, as we'll see. And whether the Johnson Amendment is applied strictly or not, the application or the lack of application, both of those can be used as a pressure tool and leverage on churches and other tax-exempt organizations. Like I said, the Johnson Amendment did not create a tax-exempt status for churches. They already were. That tax-exempt status for churches long predates the Johnson Amendment. In 1777, Virginia exempted houses for divine worship from property taxes. In 1894, the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act included income tax exemptions for charitable, religious, and educational organizations. Then in 1913, the Revenue Act of 1913 established the modern income tax system and included exemptions for these types of organizations like churches. And then in 1954, the Johnson Amendment added the no candidate endorsement or opposition condition as a condition to retain that longstanding tax-exempt status that previously had no restrictions placed on it. So, again, the Johnson Amendment did not grant anything, didn't grant a new exemption. It just put a condition on a longstanding practice. So I'll stop there, Jim. Did you have any insight or context to add to that?
Yeah, just started to get into the details, which is the point of the podcast, but I just want to back up really quick and just say that, as you pointed out, the Johnson Amendment doesn't even directly talk or address, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it addresses from the pulpit a pastor, for example, taking a policy position, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think it specifically prohibits that or anything. But that's become, unfortunately, what people think of when they say that, churches can't talk about politics. What, again, you define politics and you kind of put it in 5 different categories, but generally speaking, people think of politics as taking political positions on issues. That's what politics is. Politics leads to policy that, different levels of government make policy and vote on policy, and at the national level, our Congress makes and votes on policy. That is politics, and it's frankly just ridiculous to assume that you can't, from church, talk about something that, for example, abortion is a very, very large topic, or the life in the womb in an overwhelming majority of churches, and I believe also probably in mosques and in synagogues too, for the most part, believe in protecting life in the womb. And at least from the church perspective, the Christian perspective, that's been the case for centuries. And it wasn't until modern times that became challenged with policy. And of course, the famous Roe versus Wade decision that was overturned recently. But it's far more often that government intrudes on what are they've become political positions. They become politicized, and because they're trying to craft policy. But that doesn't mean suddenly, if the government chooses to make to pursue some argument, to pursue some kind of policy change or whatever, that therefore, as soon as that starts, you can no longer talk about it in church. That's ridiculous. So, because that would be infringing on free speech, for example. So, I wanted to just clarify that up front, because that stems from one of the comments we got from our last episode. Just this assumption, and it's a very common assumption that a lot of people assume, that you cannot talk in church from the pulpit about anything that's quote unquote political, and that's just not true. That would be infringing on free speech, and you can't control what's political, what's not political. Everything is political these days. It gets more and more political. So I just wanted to point that out up front.
Yeah, and if we were not to take that view, if the government could restrict quote unquote political speech, And there would be no wall or check valve that would then prevent them from taking any or every biblical issue, politicizing it, and then telling the church you can no longer talk about what the Bible says about these things because they're now political issues. That is the concern. The flip side of that concern, which was expressed by some of the viewers and listeners after the last episode, is that in a system of freely competing ideas, don't we run the risk of people from other denominations and other religions advocating for their views as well that could take root in our legal system and become law? We'll get to that in a second, but the short answer is yes. Yes, we do. And that's why you can't not participate, because every other worldview is there in the public square and is vying for hearts and minds and trying to win support. And they're doing their job to advocate for their views. But are we? So this tax exemption, it's a significant and meaningful financial benefit to 501c3 organizations, to include churches. And the fear that someone can then exploit that benefit and turn a church, a quote-unquote church, into a tax-sheltered political action committee, that's not a crazy idea. That's not a crazy fear. That's a legitimate concern. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what the Johnson Amendment was. Well, I won't say that's exactly what it was designed to do. That is its function. That's what it does. Why that was put in place, we'll get to in a second. So you're not a crazy person if you have that concern that a church completely unrestricted could essentially just become a place where tax-free money is funneled to political candidates and it becomes a super PAC. But I think we can oppose taxpayer-subsidized electioneering without endorsing censorship on sermons. And that's the concern we were talking about just a little bit ago. The clean boundary, I think, the safest boundary, arguably where the Johnson Amendment draws it, is protect speech, but prohibit campaign cash. That line isn't always that clean in how this amendment is applied, though. There's an irony to this whole thing, this whole Johnson Amendment or arrangement about what churches can and can't do. The irony is this. Last week, we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, one of the clearest examples in American history of churches speaking into public life. Dr. King was a Baptist pastor. Dr. King did not stay in a theological bubble, though. From pulpits to church basements to prayer meetings, churches confronted segregation laws, pressured elected officials, organized boycotts, and demanded legislative change. They advocated on issues, advocated for a change in policy. And here's the historical irony. The civil rights movement actually unfolded in its final phases under President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the author of the Johnson Amendment itself. The Johnson Amendment was passed in 1954. The very next year, the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. Then we had the Birmingham campaign in 1963. The March on Washington, 1963 as well. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. The president, during the peak legislative victories of the civil rights movement, was President Johnson, the author of the Johnson Amendment. Yet there was no mass revocation of tax exemptions for the churches that were involved in the civil rights movement. There was no broad IRS crackdown on sermons. Why is that? So the question that I would ask the audience is, based on what we just described about the Johnson Amendment, based on what we just described about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, based on those two things, do you think that Dr. King and the civil rights movement violated the Johnson Amendment? Drop us a note in the comments and let us know what you think of that. We'll talk about it here. Why? Why was the Johnson Amendment not leveraged against the civil rights movement and Dr. King? I would offer that, one, because the cause that they were involved in was morally right. That doesn't always matter to the government, what's morally right. It did in this case, and we'll talk about why in a second. The cause was morally right, and in many ways, it was politically useful to the federal government that held enforcement power at the time. Also, importantly, Dr. King also walked a very, very careful line between issue advocacy and electoral advocacy. We'll explain the differences between those two things in a little bit. But selective enforcement, could the Johnson Amendment have been used against Dr. King and the civil rights movement? Absolutely, 100%. It could have. Didn't have to be, but it could have. And the fact that there is selective application and enforcement of this particular part of the tax code teaches us a very valuable lesson, I think. The first is that when government controls enforcement, speech that is politically convenient is tolerated, and speech that isn't can be targeted. If the Johnson Amendment had been rigidly enforced, much of what we now celebrate from the civil rights movement would have been chilled significantly. Not because it was wrong, but because it was led by the church and by a pastor. Now, to answer this question, well, before I move on, Jim, do you have anything on that?
No, I just want to make it clear. And you did say it at the end there that we think it's a good thing that Martin Luther King and that movement was able to speak from the pulpit and speak in churches, and it led to good outcomes for the most part. And that, again, that's the power and the importance of free speech and protecting free speech. So, and we'll get into later on here towards the end. I found a case in 2025 where some of those protections are kind of now codified through a lawsuit that happened with the IRS. But yeah, it's a good thing that even though the Johnson Amendment could have allowed the enforcement or the shutting down of that type of speech at the time, we're glad that it didn't happen. That's all I wanted to just point out.
And there were reasons why it didn't, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And that is this line that I mentioned before that is drawn between issue advocacy and campaign intervention. Number 4 and 5 of those categories of politics that we talked about before. That line, though, is not really a line so much as it is a continuum, a spectrum. And when an organization advocates for an issue and then connects it to a candidate, the legality of doing that under the Johnson Amendment really depends entirely on how they make that connection. And Dr. Martin Luther King, however you feel about the man and what he tried to accomplish, what he did accomplish, there is no denying that he was masterful at walking this line. So here's the breakdown of how the IRS kind of looks at this in terms of activity and whether or not it violates the Johnson Amendment. You can think about it in a series of zones along this continuum or the spectrum. The first, which would be considered a safe place to operate, the green zone. And that is just pure issue advocacy. For example, our organization believes that protecting the environment is a moral imperative, and we urge our members to consider this when they go to the polls. That's very safe. You're in a very safe spot there where the IRS is concerned. It's permissible. It's a classic issue advocacy. It focuses on the issue and encourages civic participation without mentioning any particular candidate or a party. So totally safe to do that. The next rung on the ladder, if you will, low risk, but you're starting to move into the yellow zone, would be nonpartisan education. A church, or Planned Parenthood, for that matter, distributes a voter guide that shows how all candidates, candidate Smith, candidate Jones, candidate Brown, have voted or responded to questionnaires on a wide variety of issues: environment, healthcare, defense, taxes, abortion, etc. It doesn't single out one particular event. It gives you a list of positions for each of these candidates. Generally, that is also permissible, as long as the guide is unbiased in its presentation, covers multiple issues, and includes all of the viable candidates, doesn't just zero in or focus on one. It's considered voter education. It's not considered to be direct campaign intervention, and it equips voters without telling them specifically how to vote. And that's where you cross the line in the Johnson Amendment, is when you start telling people to vote for a particular person. Above that, the zone just past that is, now we're moving into a high-risk area, the orange zone. And this would be biased or sham voter education, where an organization distributes a voter guide that only covers a single issue and maybe only talks about a single candidate. And it shows that that candidate Smith, for example, candidate Smith's positions align perfectly with the organization's view, while candidate Jones does not. And then that's distributed the week before the election. The timing matters to the IRS as well. So that is this orange zone is a gray area. It doesn't use magic words like "you should vote for candidate Smith." But the IRS would apply what they call a facts and circumstances test, which I'll talk about in just a second. The timing, the fact that it's done the week before an election, that matters to the IRS. The narrow focus, the fact that it's a single issue, in this case, abortion, the instance that we just gave, and the clear implication could lead the IRS to classify this as an illegal campaign intervention in disguised as voter education.
Question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So based on what you're talking about, hearkening back to our last episode when we put in a clip of Gary Hamrick's, part of Gary Hamrick's talk from the pulpit in 2020. Was this before the 2020 election? Is that right?
Yeah.
Cornerstone Chapel, Leesburg, Virginia, where my recollection is, and what the point I'm addressing you've talked about was, if you just present, a single issue or one side of an issue from the pulpit, that violates the Johnson Amendment. And my recollection of what Pastor Gary Hamrick was doing was he was presenting both sides of all the issues, both sides meaning Republican, Democrat, of all the issues from their official platforms, party platforms, and was just asking his audience, asking the congregation, which of these issues aligns more with, our values. Is that how you recall with what he did at that time?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. And he got I don't know, fined or charged by the federal government because of that sermon. I think it was because of that sermon. And to me, based on your description, that does not violate the Johnson Amendment. It was close to an election, but it definitely was not just one issue. It was presenting both issues. And he ultimately ended up fighting that charge, and he won. So maybe that's why, because how the Johnson Amendment's lined out, the way you described it, just as a layman, it sounds like he did not violate it, and I think he was justice came out in the end where he was found not guilty of that.
Yeah, I think you're right there, that the reason that it didn't cross a clear, bright line into a prohibited area was that he never came out and told the people who to vote for, didn't endorse a particular candidate. As I recall, it was more of a question. The answer, I think, was pretty heavily implied.
But you heard what he said there. A lot of people don't know what the platforms are. What do these parties believe? What do the candidates What are they standing on in terms of the platform? So we're going to have a little guessing game today called Guess the Party Platform. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you just 5 out of many issues we could talk about. By the way, they're all in this little brochure that we have available, if there's some left after the first service, called the Vote Your Values Voter Prayer Guide. It's a great publication. It was put out by Intercessors for America. But I'm going to share real quickly 5 platforms. And I'm not going to tell you the party affiliation. I want you to tell me what aligns most with your biblical worldview. Here we go. The first one is going to be on religious freedom. This party said, we value the right of America's religious leaders to preach and Americans to speak freely according to their faith. We believe the federal government, specifically the IRS, is constitutionally prohibited from policing or censoring speech based on religious convictions or beliefs. We pledge to defend the religious beliefs and rights of conscience of all Americans and to safeguard religious institutions against government control. The next party said this on the same subject, quote, we celebrate America's history of religious pluralism and tolerance and recognize the countless acts of service of our faith communities, as well as the paramount importance of maintaining the separation of church and state enshrined in our Constitution. Which party platform, number 1 and number 2, most closely resembles a biblical worldview? Number 1. The second one is the Democratic platform. I don't think they heard my sermon today. It's nowhere in the Constitution. It's not enshrined. On the subject of marriage and sexuality, these are in no particular order. This party said, quote, we will fight to enact the Equality Act. We will work to ensure LGBTQ people are not discriminated against when seeking to adopt or foster children, protect LGBTQ plus children from bullying and assault, and guarantee transgender students access to facilities based on their gender identity. We will ensure that all transgender and non-binary people can procure official government identification documents that accurately reflect their gender identity. On this same issue, the other party said this, quote, foremost among those institutions is the American family. It is the foundation of civil society, and the cornerstone of the family is natural marriage, the union of one man and one woman. We oppose the imposition of a social cultural revolution upon the American people by wrongly redefining sex discrimination, reshaping our entire society to fit the mold of an ideology alien to America's history and traditions. Is the first slide or the second slide more conducive to your biblical worldview? The second one. This is the Republican Party. Listen, the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket, Kamala Harris, boasted that as Attorney General of California, she was the first one to perform same-sex marriage in California. This is her ideology, you understand. This is what would come into the White House. Joe Biden on a town hall forum just the other night, you might have seen it on TV, when asked by a mom who had young children, he said to her, I believe it's perfectly acceptable for 8 to 10-year-old children to define their own sexuality. Have we lost our minds? How about the whole agenda of Drag Queen Story Hour? Have you been reading up on this? It's hitting the public schools where drag queens are invited in to read storybooks to elementary-age children. What is happening here? The agenda that is pushing that is a liberal progressive, I'll say demonically inspired agenda to advance that kind of a thing. On the last subject is the subject of life. This party said the Constitution's guarantee that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property deliberately echoes the Declaration of Independence's proclamation that all are endowed by their Creator with the inalienable right to life. Accordingly, we assert the sanctity of human life and affirm that the unborn child has a fundamental right to life which cannot be infringed. We support a human life amendment to the Constitution and legislation to make clear that the 14th Amendment's protections apply to children before birth. The other party said, quote, we will appoint U.S. Supreme Court justices and federal judges who will respect and enforce foundational precedents, including Roe v. Wade. We believe every woman should be able to access high-quality reproductive health care services, including safe and legal abortion. We oppose and will fight to overturn federal and state laws that create barriers to women's reproductive health and rights. Slide 1 or slide 2? Slide 1 was the Republican platform.
He didn't endorse a candidate, didn't endorse a party. and it wasn't a single issue that he was talking about. It's a gray area. It's kind of at the IRS's discretion of whether or not they choose to make an issue of it, and their chances of succeeding on the merit are not a sure thing either, because they have to prove this. They have to prove a number of things that are quite honestly difficult to prove. And I think you're right. They chose selectively to come after Cornerstone Chapel, but because of it being in this gray area and the things that we described, I think that's why they were not successful.
And really, really quick, just to wrap that up, is he's a smart guy, and now that we're defining how the Johnson Amendment is defined, he very likely read that himself and therefore crafted that sermon in order to not violate the Johnson Amendment, because he didn't do what you described. He didn't do a single issue and say you must vote for this person. Again, he purposely had all the issues and put them side by side. So that makes sense that he purposely was trying not to violate the Johnson Amendment, but they pursued him anyway. So interesting. Context.
So the fact that he didn't clearly cross a line, and it's a discretionary matter whether or not the IRS pursues it, that's that selective enforcement that we were talking about before. And in this instance, they selectively chose to try to enforce the Johnson Amendment against Cornerstone Chapel. So now it raises a question. We'll get into it a little bit more in a second, but is that when a law can be selectively enforced that way, and the ambiguity is there that allows you to go one way or the other, is that really rule of law, or is that selective enforcement of a political weapon that has been codified, in this case in the tax code? Organizations can stray even further into that orange high risk area, the dark orange, if you want to call it that. And this is implicit endorsement through praise or criticism. So from the pulpit, a pastor might give a very impassioned sermon on the sinfulness of abortion, and then say, in this election, we have candidate Jones, a good Christian who has a courageous 100% pro-life voting record. He still didn't come out and say, vote for candidate Jones, but he drew a clear connection, right? And he named a particular candidate by name. So this is the gray area. You start to get into a dark orange. It's what you would call a wink and a nod. The pastor has said, he hasn't specifically said vote for candidate Jones, but the message is pretty clear. And again, the facts and circumstances would then apply. The IRS would look at the overall message and could, in this instance, easily determine that this functions as an endorsement. And then it's at their discretion whether or not they choose to make an issue of it. And then we come to the last category, and this is the clear prohibition. This is clearly prohibited. This is the red zone, based on the actual wording of the Johnson Amendment. Express electoral advocacy. Everything we've talked about before it either squarely is or can be construed as being issue advocacy. What's clearly prohibited in the Johnson Amendment is electoral advocacy, where you might say our organization believes in protecting abortion rights. Candidate Smith supports our position. Candidate Jones opposes it. Therefore, we urge you to vote for candidate Smith next Tuesday. That is clearly not permitted under the Johnson Amendment. It's a direct, explicit, unambiguous violation of the 501c3 provisions of the tax code. It directly links an issue advocacy to an electoral command. And that is the thing that the Johnson Amendment clearly prohibits. So the answer to the question directly is that when an organization strongly advocates for an issue and then explicitly tells people how they should vote as a result, that is not permissible under 501c3. Or if they implicitly connect the issue to a candidate through biased guides disguised as voter education or pointed praise or criticism, it enters a dangerous legal gray area. It's not automatically impermissible, but it definitely invites IRS scrutiny and could be ruled as a violation based on the facts and circumstances of the case, depending on who's looking at it and what the mood of the folks who were in power at the time might be in. So that is That's kind of how the Johnson Amendment is viewed and how it's determined whether or not whether a particular speech or action is permissible or not under the Johnson Amendment. So we mentioned previously that in a positive light, making the argument that pastors and churches should not be prohibited from participation in politics. We mentioned that the civil rights movement was organized in church basements. It was led by a pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King. He explicitly used religious and moral language to make his case. He definitely leveraged his status as a minister. Many of his rallies and speeches were held in churches, delivered from behind a pulpit. He directly called out specific politicians whose actions and policies were contrary to what he and the civil rights movement were trying to accomplish, particularly those politicians in Alabama and Georgia. Governor Wallace, Bull Connor, right?
Friends, we are certainly very happy to see each of you out this evening. We are here this evening for serious business. We are here in a general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens. And we are determined to acquire our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning. But we are here in a specific sense because of the bus situation in Montgomery. We are here because we are determined to get the situation corrected. This situation is not at all new. The problem has existed over endless years. You know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. That we are Christian people. We believe in the Christian religion. We believe in the teachings of Jesus. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dream that never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down that water. Let us be Christian in all of our actions. But I want to tell you this evening that it is not enough for us to talk about love. Love is one of the pivotal parts of the Christian faith. There is another side called justice. And justice is really love in calculation. Justice is love correcting that which revolts against love. The Almighty God Himself is not the God just standing out saying through Hosea, I love you, Israel. He's also the God that stands up before the nations and says, be still and know that I'm God. relationship. Standing beside love is always justice. And we are only using the tools of justice. Not only are we using the tools of persuasion, but we've come to see that we've got to use the tools of coercion. Not only is this thing a process of education, but it is also a process of legislation. I think that we will do it before it is too late. As we proceed with our program, let us think of these things.
So, was Martin Luther King Jr. in violation of the Johnson Amendment? Again, leave us a comment below and let us know what you think. Our view, again, looking at the words of the amendment itself and looking at how it's defined, our view is technically, well, I should say mine, I don't know about you, Jim. My view is technically no. Dr. Martin Luther King and his organization, I think almost certainly were not in clear violation of the Johnson Amendment. However, and this is the very important point, the only reason they weren't in violation is because of a very fine legalistic line between issue advocacy and electoral advocacy. And more importantly, because of the political realities of the time. The Johnson Amendment could have been used against them, but those in power chose not to. His actions and his words walked right up to the line, but didn't cross it. So you think about what he did. He denounced politicians like George Wallace and Bull Connor. And I think this is probably the most critical distinction. Dr. King attacked their actions, their policies, and their moral failures, but he did not engage in express electoral advocacy. He was practicing issue advocacy, not campaign intervention. He said, essentially, segregation is a sin, and George Wallace's policy of segregation is morally wrong. He did not say, in the upcoming governor's election, I urge you to vote against George Wallace. It's a very fine line, but it's the legal line. And he was trying to change behavior and change policy without specifically and explicitly telling people who to vote for in an election. Definitely in that orange to dark orange area. Holding rallies and speeches in churches. So an outside organization can use church spaces and facilities for a meeting or a rally that's focused on a moral issue. It's not specific. It's not explicitly a political event. They're there to talk about a moral issue. The church is just the venue. The violation would occur if the church itself organized the event for the express purpose of endorsing or opposing a particular candidate. So as long as Dr. King and the SCLC were the primary organizers and not the church that they were using, and the message was one of issue advocacy and not an endorsement or opposition to a particular candidate, then they thread that needle as well and don't cross the clear line into the prohibited area for the Johnson Amendment. The fact that he was a minister and he leveraged that status to its maximum extent. Legally, though, his personal status as a minister is irrelevant where the Johnson Amendment is concerned, because the amendment constrains the organization, the 501c3 church, not the individual. So as a private citizen, even as a pastor, Dr. King had the First Amendment right to say anything he wanted. The only question is whether or not he used his leadership of a 501c3 organization, a church, to direct that organization into an expressed electioneering type of an action. And he was very, very careful not to do that. And so The SCLC's mission was always focused on voter registration, boycotts, and protests for policy change, issue advocacy, not on endorsing or explicitly opposing a particular candidate. So, a pretty masterful threading of a needle. He was in the orange area for sure, and the IRS could have come after him, but they didn't. And we'll talk about why they didn't here in just a second. But do you have anything on what we just talked about?
Now, I'll just maybe jump ahead to maybe my opinion about why they may not have. He may have, in a sense, been egging them on a little bit, but potentially, I don't know that, because it could have backfired. It could have helped his cause at the time if the government came after him formally. So maybe he was, but he was careful, like you said. He's a very smart guy. Had a lot of really good advisors around him, so was just being very careful about threading that needle. But like you said, it is kind of a gray area, an orange area, and the government could have chosen to do it, but that could have helped his cause, and maybe that's almost what he either wanted to happen or was if it did happen, he knew it would potentially help his cause, but it was a risk. I mean, he was a courageous guy, so he took some major chances, and that could have shut down everything that he was trying to accomplish. So definitely was a brave guy and thoughtful. Anyway, but I'm kind of just guessing as to what his strategy was.
Well, there's some facts, but there's also interpretation of facts. So I don't claim to be an expert really on anything, but I do enjoy reading, and I form an opinion, which I would like to believe is an informed and educated opinion, but it doesn't mean it's the only opinion out there. What I believe, though, as I'm asking myself the question, why would President Johnson's administration never have used his own amendment to go after Dr. King and the civil rights movement? And I think it's because Lyndon Johnson needed Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was essentially the battering ram that Johnson needed to break down the political opposition in his own party, in his own agenda. The Southern segregationist Democrats. Johnson, controversial figure. Whatever you think about him, he was a pretty brilliant politician. He was very shrewd, and I think he knew that he needed the Civil Rights Act for what he was trying to do, and he knew he couldn't pass the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act on his own. He needed overwhelming public and political pressure to overcome the very powerful voting bloc in the South at the time, the segregationist Democrats. So the moral crisis that Dr. King and his movement created, these images from Birmingham and Selma, broadcast across the nation, that was the source of the pressure, the political pressure that Johnson needed. And so it would not have been in his best interest to use his own amendment to shut down this movement that's helping him, intentionally or not, toward his own political goals. Speaking of political goals, Johnson and King shared some common enemies. The politicians that Dr. King was attacking, like Governor Wallace, those were Johnson's political enemies too, and so they were obstacles in his schemes for the Great Society. So King attacking those folks from the outside was a benefit to Johnson, kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a thing. And then lastly, I think the optics of it would have just been terrible if Johnson had unleashed the IRS on these churches that were involved in the civil rights movement. It would have been political suicide for Kennedy or Johnson to just bring down the full weight of the IRS on these African American churches in the middle of a fight which was gaining public support and was widely accepted as a struggle for basic human rights. It would have just been an indefensible abuse of power and political suicide to come after their tax-exempt status, given the way that the cultural winds were shifting. And that's a key point. The application, the enforcement of the Johnson Amendment in these gray areas, it really comes down to the cultural winds of the time and the political moods and preferences of the people who get to decide whether or not to use it. And that brings me to my question of, if that is true, and I think it is, I think the history we just laid out demonstrates that it is that describing the rule of law? Or is it selective application of carefully crafted political tools that can be used or not at the government's discretion? Jim is having connectivity issues. We'll try to get him back here in just a second. He's working on it. But to continue that thought, the words and actions of Dr. King and his movement certainly fall squarely into this high-risk orange zone that we described earlier. Actions described as that could be described as biased sham voter education and implicit endorsements through praise or criticism of political figures and candidates. That even though they didn't use the magic words of vote for or vote against this particular individual, still constitutes that wink and a nod. Is that a fair characterization of Dr. King and his movement and what they did? You can leave us a note in the comments to let us know your view on that. Is that a fair statement? Dr. King and the civil rights movement, as I said before, were masters of operating in this high-risk orange zone. They pushed the boundaries of the law as far as they could without overtly crossing into the expressed electoral advocacy or an explicit candidate endorsement. Even though their objective was clearly political and aimed at legislative change, they still walked that very fine line. So if we review that criteria that we just talked about and kind of hold Dr. King and the civil rights movement up against it, the criteria in those orange and dark orange zones. So biased sham voter education, is that what the civil rights movement did? The SCLC voter education project wasn't neutral. It wasn't just an academic exercise. Its explicit goal was to register millions of African American voters in the South who had been illegally disenfranchised. And that was the voting bloc that was going to counteract the Southern segregationist Democrats that Johnson needed to defeat. So while the civil rights movement framed it as education, everybody involved knew that it would create a massive new voting bloc that would overwhelmingly oppose Johnson's opponents. It was a voter mobilization targeted with surgical precision toward legislative policy change and particular political figures. Welcome back, Jim.
Thanks.
So we're going over the actions of Dr. King and the civil rights movement that do fall squarely into that orange zone, that high risk zone where they operated effectively. So the second area of criteria here, this implicit endorsement through praise and criticism. So like I said, while Dr. King didn't explicitly come out and say vote for so-and-so or vote against Governor Wallace, vote against these people, he definitely offered a lot of praise and criticism, praising his allies and criticizing the opponents. And so was that an implicit endorsement, like the Johnson Amendment talks about in this high risk area? I think this was Dr. King's signature tactic. The optics were great, right? He would stand on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol and he would declare, "We are not afraid." He was delivering a moral indictment of Governor George Wallace. the biblical um, the biblical parallel of the prophet coming out, calling out, and challenging the king. By leading a march in Selma, he was passing judgment on the brutality of Sheriff Jim Clark. He never had to say, vote against these people. The context of the times, the moral condemnation that he was applying in these scenarios, both verbally and visually, that was the political message. The wink and the nod was perfectly understood by everybody from the sharecroppers in Mississippi all the way up to the Oval Office. So if the civil rights movement was clearly, and Dr. King was clearly operating in this orange to dark orange high-risk area, why then would I say that they were not in violation of the Johnson Amendment? They could have been, but they weren't, because they weren't prosecuted in that way. The orange zone, that gray area where the law specifically requires the IRS to prove a facts and circumstances case, and they don't have to if they don't want to. It's not an automatic violation if you're in that orange zone. The government would have to prove that your primary purpose of a sermon or a particular speech or a voter guide was electoral intervention, not genuine issue advocacy or moral teaching.
Like you said, Dr. King was shrewd. So was the president at the time. They both kind of knew what they were doing and kind of played off each other's strategy for their own benefit. Dr. King probably, again, was very wise on the Johnson Amendment and knew what he was doing, knew he was in what you call the orange zone, which is a little bit of a risk, or maybe a big risk, but didn't go into the red, cross the line, so to speak. So very wise, very shrewd. And like you said, it benefited the president at the time to not persecute or prosecute or go after Dr. King. And the churches. It's not just Dr. King. Like you said, it's the churches themselves that were hosting Dr. King's speeches, as well as probably preaching the similar things from their own pastors at those churches out of the pulpit as well.
Yeah. You think about how it would have gone had the IRS come after them and this had gone to court. I mean, you can really imagine. You can imagine what Dr. King's defense would have been. It would have been simple. It would have been powerful. It would have been effective. Like most things that he said. You can almost hear him say it, that I'm not telling people who to vote for. I'm just a minister of the gospel, and I'm telling my people that segregation is a sin. I'm telling them that brutality is evil. And if a politician chooses to wrap himself in the banner of sin and evil, that's a matter of his conscience and has nothing to do with my tax status. It'd be a very simple and powerful rebuttal. But if you see an apparent contradiction in what King and the civil rights movement were doing and how the Johnson administration chose to apply or not the Johnson Amendment, if you see a contradiction in that, you're certainly not alone, and you're not necessarily wrong. His actions absolutely fit the description of that high-risk wink and nod behavior. But he was able to operate in that orange zone with impunity because the legal case against him would have been very weak. And more importantly, the political and moral case against prosecuting him would have been overwhelming. So the key, both then and now, is understanding how social change actually happens. It happens in these gray areas, or in this case, the orange area, where activists push the boundaries of the law, they're shielded by either the power of their own moral argument or the political realities of the moment. And Dr. King had both of those working in his favor. So you might think, as I do, by that analysis, then shouldn't a pastor or a church today be able to operate with equal liberty in that high-risk orange zone? And for that matter, use Dr. King's own defense and claim as a precedent. So, like, for instance, on the issue of abortion, for example, couldn't today's pastor claim a similar moral high ground and state that I'm not telling people who to vote for? I'm a minister of the gospel, and I'm telling my people that murder, exterminating an unborn child is wrong. It's a sin. And I'm telling them that that kind of brutality is evil. And if a politician chooses to wrap himself in the banner of that sin and evil, that's a matter for his conscience and has nothing to do with my tax status. Wouldn't it be the same argument? And the answer is that in theory, yes, it's the exact same argument. And a pastor absolutely should be able to make that argument and use Dr. King as a precedent. The legal and rhetorical structure of the argument is exactly the same. However, in practice, the outcome would most likely be profoundly different. The reason is that King's argument wasn't just a legal argument. It was a product of his unique time in history. It's difficult to replicate. His precedent stands on three legs or three supports, and the modern pastor only has one of them. The first is the legal argument, which we said is the same then and now. So the modern pastor would have that support, but he doesn't have the other two, which is national moral consensus. At best, the issue of abortion is almost down the middle, sadly, in our country. So a pastor would not enjoy the same type of moral consensus that was behind King. And then the political context shifts. King had the support of the political structure at the time, which ironically was Lyndon Johnson. It happened to be in Johnson's best interest. A pastor at this particular moment in history, under the Trump administration, would have the same support. But there's no guarantee that the next administration would be equally supportive. So, again, is that rule of law or selective application of a political tool at the government's discretion? And it really seems like the latter, because it can be applied so selectively. So I think that historical case study that we tried to lay out there, combined with our own recent observations, would suggest that the Johnson Amendment and the rule of law in general is not necessarily objective. It's not necessarily evenly applied principally, but rather hinges solely on political and moral moods of the time, the preference of whoever happens to be in power at the moment. As modern day examples of this, some people might point to January 6th and say that's a perfect example of what I just described. Other people might point to the BLM riots and say that's the perfect example. Others might look at the enforcement or lack of enforcement for our immigration laws. The point being that selective application of the law is at odds with the whole concept of the rule of law. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, well, I think another example, and I was trying to research this specific situation, but I'm pretty certain that I think both candidate Biden and President Biden, who, as candidate Biden running for president, when he won his presidency, compared to, because he ran several times, most recent time, and when he's president, took a stance supporting, he was pro-abortion, had a pro-abortion stance. And I know at least one Catholic, either bishop or priest, came out publicly and against that position because President Biden is a Catholic, and the pro-abortion stance is against the Catholic Church's principles and teachings. So I was just trying to research unsuccessfully before I brought this up, but like when that happened and what the circumstances were. But maybe before the end of this podcast, I can try to find that. But I'm pretty certain that happened. And again, that would be, to my knowledge, nothing happened to that Catholic priest, and that would be potentially a selective, non-persecution, I guess you could say, or non-enforcement of the Johnson Amendment, where it's definitely in the orange area, if not the red area, crossing the line, criticizing a specific candidate not telling people to not vote for him, I don't think, if I recall, but I'll try to verify that. But so that's a modern example where I'm kind of surprised, frankly, that in that situation that more wasn't done, especially during that administration, to that priest. But it just reinforces the point that that the government will oftentimes be very selective at how it enforces its regulations, sometimes even if it does cross the red line, so to speak.
And that's what makes people so jaded with the concept of the law, is that they see it as a two-tiered system, not equally applied. Justice is not blind, and that it's used by politicians to help their friends and hurt their enemies. And what you just described there, I remember that as well. And the reason, as you described, that it's in the orange area and not in the red is that, as I recall at least, that priest did not specifically tell anybody to vote for or against President Biden. The implication, though, and it's the implication that puts it in the orange area, is that good Catholics are against abortion. And if you're a good Catholic, you stand with the church on that issue. And by the way, this guy, this politician who claims to be a Catholic, does not hold that view. And so it's now up to the listeners to take that implication and connect the dots on their own without specifically telling them, don't vote for that guy if you're a good Catholic and you want to be in good standing with the church. So yeah, definitely in the orange area, right up next to the line.
Yeah, so I found some little more details here. So multiple Catholic priests and bishops have publicly criticized Joe Biden regarding his support for abortion rights during his time as candidate and as president. Notable instances of clergy speaking out. There's a denial of communion back in October 2019. Father Robert Morey of St. Anthony Catholic Church in South Carolina denied then-candidate Biden Holy Communion. He stated that, quote, any public figure who advocates for abortion places himself or herself outside of church teaching. And there was Cardinal Wilton Gregory of Washington, D.C., described Biden as a cafeteria Catholic who steps aside on hot-button issues like abortion to his own political advantage. And there's a couple other examples there. And whether these actions violate the Johnson Amendment gets into that orange area again. So let's see, it says that issue advocacy versus candidate endorsement, which you pointed out. So, these priests are focusing on the issue, which is should, in my opinion, and I think our opinion, should be protected, but did not advocate voting for or against President Biden. So that just kind of reinforces what you're saying there.
A cafeteria Catholic. That's even worse than a back row Baptist, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's pretty clever use of words there. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. So that was kind of a rundown of the Johnson Amendment itself, and then applying it in a real historic case study in the instance of the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King. So now we bring all that back around to the issue and the question that was brought up by the listener, that the argument that was presented, that is, if churches are going to be involved in politics, we should tax them. The problem, as we said at the outset, is with the word politics. If by politics we mean endorsing candidates or acting as a campaign finance machine, then that restriction already exists. If an organization wants to do that, they are going to lose their tax-exempt status. But if politics is defined as simply addressing moral questions of the day that shape public policy, whether that's abortion, racial injustice, family law, environmentalism, religious liberty, whatever, then tax them if they speak actually becomes silence them if they speak. And that makes speech, free speech, which is guaranteed under the First Amendment, that makes free speech conditional upon paying taxes. And if we're going to take that all the way to its full logical conclusion, if you don't pay taxes, you don't get a say, then the roughly 40% of Americans that pay zero federal income taxes would instantly have to be disenfranchised as well. But free speech and political participation is not a pay-to-play proposition, I would offer. And the argument was never that the church had to be silent in exchange for its tax-exempt status, because they had that tax-exempt status before the Johnson Amendment ever existed. The argument may be emotionally driven by fear of religious coercion. For instance, we don't want churches to speak because the next church that comes out strongly for or against something might be, the local Muslim mosque and its imam advocating for Sharia law. So the concept of we need to tax them in order to keep them quiet might come from that fear of religious coercion, but the proposed mechanism, taxing churches if they quote unquote do politics, actually creates a coercion lever for the government, which is precisely what the First Amendment prohibits. Once the government controls that lever, it doesn't matter whether the target is a conservative, Christian, progressive, Muslim, or secular. The power always flows in one direction, and that's toward the regulator. It's the one-way check valve that's flipped around, and the flow is going in the wrong direction, where the government has all of the control and the church has none of the say. So again, I think the safest position is that we protect free speech, all free speech, even hate speech, because the whole point of free speech is to protect the speech that other people do not like. That's not really a popular opinion in many circles.
Right.
But
and hate speech
the safest position, I think,
subjective. How do you define hate?
Right.
Depends on who you talk to, what's hateful, what's not, so that's already a slippery slope, which is very controversial.
Yeah. And maybe here in a little bit, we'll talk about these words that we use in our law really have no meaning except the meaning that our national morality pour into them. And that becomes important. But for purposes of figuring out who's tax exempt and who's not, I think we have to protect the speech, all speech. Government has no business telling pastors or imams or anybody else what to preach in their sermons. But they do have a right, I think, to restrict campaign money. A tax exemption that, from the government's perspective, is there to assist the church in providing for a public good that ostensibly takes pressure off of the government and its responsibilities. And so I think it's completely reasonable that tax-free money can't be used as a campaign finance machine. Don't let governments decide which sermons are acceptable, regardless of faith or denomination, is where I come down at the end of the day on that. Completely reasonable, though, to talk about restricting tax-free funds.
Yeah, and in recent history, this was finally formally challenged in court, with some success in the sense of carving out a little bit more protections formally, because there is a lot of gray area in the Johnson Amendment. So in July 2025, the IRS settled a lawsuit that was filed in 2024, and is, I guess, referred to as the National Religious Broadcasters versus Long. And the plaintiffs were challenging some Johnson Amendment's restrictions. So a lot of people don't know about this, and it was just surprising because it was very recent. Let's see here. So the IRS settled a lawsuit by clarifying that the amendment does not prohibit houses of worship from speaking about candidates, quote, in good faith, unquote, to congregations through customary religious channels, such as sermons, when framed as matters of faith. This carve-out allows limited pulpit political speech without risking tax-exempt status, though direct contributions, ads, or broad campaigning remain banned. This change enhances free speech for churches, but raises concerns about those on the opposite camp about politicizing pulpits and eroding nonpartisanship. In 2025, the lawsuit that challenged the Johnson Amendment included the plaintiffs, the National Religious Broadcasters, which is a Christian media advocacy group, Intercessors for America, a Christian prayer and advocacy organization, Sand Springs Church in Athens, Texas, and First Baptist Church, Wascom in Texas. And the defendant, the IRS, along with its commissioner, initially Danny Werfel. The suit was filed in August 2024, and in July 2025, the plaintiffs and the IRS jointly proposed a consent judgment settlement, leading to a carve-out allowing certain pulpit speech on candidates framed as faith matters without risking tax-exempt status. The case remained ongoing as of late 2025, with interventions attempted, such as by Americans United for Separation of Church and State, denied in December 2025, and no final ruling on the settlement in available records. This effectively made the IRS and the religious plaintiffs aligned in the settlement push. So it seems like this is still open for a final judgment, but the settlement itself seems to set a precedent that does carve out very explicit protections for speech from the pulpit that is right in line with what you've been talking about, and is right in line with kind of that orange area that was kind of danger zone, kind of moving that more down to maybe the yellow zone a little bit more explicitly, which is good news.
Yeah, it's really just a temporary change though, right? Because like we were talking about, it's all selective enforcement, and the IRS, according to that, has just stated, here's how we now intend to enforce this. We backed up a little bit more freedom given to pastors in their pulpits without risking their tax exempt status. But it's selective. That could change with the next administration, and probably will.
Yeah.
If it goes, if the parties switch. But ultimately, that all comes back to what we were talking about last week in the First Amendment, that the separation of church and state, it was originally meant to restrain the government. And if that is true, then using tax law as a leverage point over speech runs opposite to the original intent. Tax leverage becomes speech leverage, and that's exactly what a free people should resist. You should be able to say what you want. That doesn't mean you can spend tax-free money any way you want, though. So we talked about, you had mentioned it, that when we use particular words in our modern lexicon, those words are politically charged, and they really only have the meaning that our current national morality pours into those words. And so why that matters, John Adams, you mentioned this last week as well on the previous episode, that he had mentioned that our Constitution is made only for a moral and a religious people and is wholly inadequate for any other. And his point, I don't think, was that government should, well, I know it wasn't. His point was not that government should coerce faith. His point was that our form of government presupposes a sort of self-governance, where people restrain themselves through their conscience, through virtue and moral formation. But what informs your conscience and your concept of virtue and your moral formation? As a society becomes more and more pluralistic, that question becomes harder and harder to answer. And therefore, how do we maintain a quote-unquote moral people, as Adams described, when we can't even agree on what morality is? And I'm edging toward the second question and concern that the listeners raised was, in this government, in this free society where anybody can say what they want, even from the pulpit, do we not run the risk of people and religions that we might disagree with saying things and influencing public policy? And as I said before, the short answer is yes, you absolutely run that risk. It's part of what Jefferson called a dangerous freedom that we get to enjoy. But this is why it becomes so important to have a common set of principles and values around which we unite. It's why the framers, why the founders, put so much emphasis on e pluribus unum, and that our national model is not e pluribus pluribus, out of many, many. Diversity in and of itself is not an inherent strength. So this takes us to, I think, the bedrock issue that is beneath all of it, and that is a national identity that can build a public social trust. And I think everybody can look around and see that we don't necessarily have that going in our favor at the moment. Political thinkers, going all the way back to Aristotle, all the way up to the present, have warned that a republic struggles to survive if it becomes just a geographic space that's inhabited by a bunch of competing tribes with no shared moral language. And increasingly, I think that's what America's becoming. There's these two models. One is the melting pot. I think everybody's heard that analogy before, and what it's talking about there is assimilation. When we talk about a melting pot, it's assimilation. That is e pluribus unum, out of many one, where newcomers adopt the national language, they adopt the core political values, and the primary civic loyalty that comes with being an American. The other model is what you might call the salad bowl. That's multiculturalism. Out of many, many, e pluribus pluribus. Groups coexist, but they retain their own distinct and competing identities and have very little in terms of a unifying creed. That is what we've actually promoted in recent years in the United States. And the United States are becoming less and less united as a result of it.
Like as I often do, I come back to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident: all men are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain rights, and government's job is to enforce those rights and not to infringe upon them. That right there is the unity. So it doesn't matter to me what part of the world you come from. For immigrants, as long as you are willing to agree with that principle, the principles within that phrase, there's several principles within that phrase we talked about before, then you can assimilate perfectly well within America. Unfortunately, many of people born in America the last few generations, that whole concept has been undermined in a lot of our in schools, especially the universities, tried to undermine that whole concept, which has led to a weakness in our country. Because with that phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. We all care. I mean, both sides, again, care about equality, and it's right there in the Declaration of Independence. But it seems like huge factions of the political extremes kind of try to flush that down the toilet, or say it's outdated, or all kinds of excuses. But you talk about the e pluribus unum, out of many people from different places around the world, which is basically how America started, obviously. Yes, most of the immigrants in the first part of the country's founding were from Europe, different European countries. but we've had immigrants from all over the world, obviously, and an overwhelming majority of those immigrants have believed strongly in the phrase from the Declaration of Independence, and that phrase has led to, women's suffrage. It's led to ultimately the abolition of slavery. We've talked about how Frederick Douglass, former slave, it's the Declaration of Independence. Martin Luther King himself referenced the Declaration of Independence, called it the promissory note, basically a check that has not been fully realized, starting at our very founding, and that's 100% true. Anyway, so it is a phrase that I think that if we, and a concept that if we try to readopt across party lines, rearticulate, and the problem with it, I think, is because it's become a cliche. Everyone knows the Declaration of Independence. Almost everyone knows that phrase, but we've forgotten to examine what it means and the origin behind it and how it's led to freedom around the world. Never mind in America. Yeah, but that's because that concept has gone away and it's been kind of considered as passé or even outdated or misguided or misinterpreted. This idea of that America is supposed to be, like you said, a salad bowl instead of a melting pot is, I mean, no country, no organization of any kind can really survive if you don't have a unifying principle that unifies the organization or the nation. And it goes for any business, it goes for, military, you all need to be striving towards a common goal, having a common mission. So yeah, that's kind of a sub theme of our podcast. It's one of the things we try to come back to. And one of the purposes of the topics that we talk about is to help people to think. We have our political stances, our political leanings and biases, but it's ultimately meant to bring people back to a unifying message that is moral and ethical and unifying for making this country stronger, because there's been so much division. It's gotten so bad. You and I weren't around in the 60s, but it seems like from what we've read about the 60s, speaking of Martin Luther King, in his era, very, very divisive, very tumultuous, a lot of uncertainty about what people believed and what was important and what was valuable, what was good, what was bad. That's really been happening again the last few years in America and in the West. The UK, a lot of European countries also succumbing to this moral confusion that's led to a lot of disruption and a lot of questioning about what values are important. So that's what we're trying to get back to, is kind of help ourselves think and clarify what those principles are, and help others to think as well, and try to bring people back to a consensus that makes us strong.
Yeah, the entire American experiment is founded on that principle of unity. A shared moral consciousness, if you will. And I've read it described as the difference between a thin morality and a thick morality, meaning that a thin morality is we all share a set of common morals, an understanding of virtue, civic duty in general, of decency. And then that would be the thin morality that holds everybody together. And then the thick morality would be the specifics of your particular faith, your view of the Trinity, whether you even believe in the Trinity, or the nature of God, or the origins of creation, whatever. The problem, though, is when those spheres start to mingle, where our thick moralities get inserted into political conversations. That's where we start to run the risk of the one-way check valve between church and state starting to break down. However, as we said before, laws are really just moral codes. You can't really have a law without a moral that it's either encouraging or prohibiting. And so, if laws are just moral codes, somebody is going to decide what morality goes into those laws. And this is what brings us back to the question and the concern and the fear that was raised by a couple of listeners. If our shared thin morality disappears, law ceases to be a neutral protector of rights and becomes a weapon for one tribe to dominate another. And that tribe that dominates might not be yours. It might not be mine. And that's the fear, right? And then the fears of people start to rise, shifting majorities, coercive laws, religious or ideological capture. Those things start to sound less hypothetical and start to feel very real and scary for a lot of people.
Hadith from the Prophet Muhammad instructs, whomever among you sees a wrong, let him change it with his hand. If he is not able, then with his tongue. If he is not able, then with his heart.
Make no mistake, people. 2020 is our year. Let's dive into it with 2020 vision. We can see clearly that America is fighting for its very soul.
We all come from the same root here in terms of our fundamental basic beliefs. And I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity, for being engaged, for committing to action this November. It matters. Your voice is your vote. Your vote is your voice. Muslim Americans' voices matter. I'll be a president who seeks out and listens to and incorporates the ideas and concerns of Muslim Americans on everyday issues that matter most to our communities. That will include having Muslim American voices as part of my administration.
But getting out the vote, getting our families out to vote, getting our elderly out to vote, getting our masjids out to vote, getting our neighborhoods out to vote. So let's do our part
and join the largest Muslim voter mobilization in America,
the Million Muslim Votes campaign. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's make our voices heard. Because we got the means, we got the numbers, and we got the power.
Every other worldview is there in the public square and is vying for hearts and minds and trying to win support. And they're doing their job to advocate for their views. But are we? I go back to my short answer to that question, though. Yes, it is possible for America to be legally changed into something that is unrecognizable, using our own system to do it. That vulnerability is baked into a Republican self-government. You might say that every republic carries within itself the seeds of its destruction, and the only thing that prevents those seeds from taking root and sprouting and taking over the whole field is maintenance by the gardeners. It's the dangerous freedom that I was talking about before that Jefferson said that we enjoy. We have a dangerous freedom, and I would much prefer a dangerous freedom than to be a kept citizen. The only real safeguard, though, is the diligence and participation of good people, and including, and I would say especially, God's people, using lawful means to preserve the foundations of liberty and of this country that made it what it is.
Yeah, and I want to we come back to several episodes we've talked about, including the last one, that our morals shouldn't come from government anyway. Government enforces morals that are already publicly defined and generally agreed to, and that's where we're going into some dangerous territory lately, because the public is getting very divided on the source of those morals, and that gets back to I think it was 2 episodes ago, conservative credo episode, where we laid out what by and large our general belief of the source of our morality and how that should influence how our government runs, or the values that our government should have, and the values that were the foundational values of our government that led to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all these things we talked about before. But government itself should not define those morals. The laws should support and enforce the morals that are already there. And, we believe that moral foundation and the articulation of those moral values, by and large, comes from religious institutions, comes from the church, which goes right back, kind of closing the loop full circle to why it's so important that the government should not suppress speech in church, because that's the church itself. And again, just to be fair about freedom of religion, not just the church, but the mosques and synagogues are also talking about moral values from their perspectives, their respective perspectives. That should not be suppressed, because without that moral discussion coming from the churches, and when I say the church, it's not just the church building, it's the people in the church, the congregation, then it creates a vacuum that the government will fill. And we see that around the world, where governments do define what's right and wrong. And that almost always goes awry eventually. It spirals out of control, because if government's in control of defining morality and what's right and wrong, we all know governments are corruptible and corrupted, because power corrupts, and they will define the laws and enforce the laws that protect them, that protect the power, those in power in government. Maduro in Venezuela recently is a perfect example of that. So just kind of back to the point of how, and it does tie into the Johnson Amendment discussion, because like you said, the government has selectively enforced certain aspects of the Johnson Amendment, when it fits its purposes, and that's dangerous. We have to have a clear guidelines as to what the government will enforce based on moral principles that are defined outside of government.
Yeah, I think the solution to bring it all home is to follow Thomas Jefferson's advice in embracing this dangerous freedom that we get to enjoy, rather than be afraid of it and recoil. As you said offline in a different conversation, have faith in your faith. Do your duty as a citizen. Get involved in the public square. Advocate for the things that you believe. Don't rely on the government to protect you from all the bad ideas of the world. You have a duty, we have a duty as citizens to engage, to have faith in our faith. Charlie Kirk summarized this tension that we feel. Where we're talking about a lack of assimilation, multiculturalism, pluralism, which is bringing to our shores people who don't share our values, and they're not required to inculcate them or assimilate. And so we're getting a lot of values and belief systems and cultures that don't align with what America has traditionally been. And Charlie Kirk said one of the reasons that we're living through a constitutional crisis is that we no longer have a Christian nation, but we have a Christian form of government. It doesn't work.
John Adams famously said the Constitution was only written for a moral and religious people. It was wholly inadequate for the people of any other. The body politic of America was so Christian and was so Protestant that our form and structure of government was built for the people that believed in Christ our Lord. One of the reasons we're living through a constitutional crisis is that we no longer have a Christian nation, but we have a Christian form of government, and they're incompatible.
So whether you agree with Charlie Kirk's framing or not, the underlying question is still, I think, unavoidable. Can a free system such as ours survive without and disconnected from the moral formation that it assumes? And I think the answer is no.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But I'd be interested to hear what people have to say about that in the comments. So leave us a note.
Yeah, absolutely. Please comment, ask us questions. We try to respond to all the questions we can, and we also recognize that we refer to the church a lot, and the church being the foundation of moral values, and we all know many churches that have fallen short of that. So when we say the church, we mean the church as a whole, the Church of Christ, but individual churches within that have gone astray many times, and pastors and leaders of those churches as well. So it's not a black and white issue, but it's something that's worth talking about and worth discussing, and worth getting just trying to get people kind of more in line with understanding what is the source of truth in our lives, in society, and ultimately in our government as well. So,
As a parting thought, I know you've got a hard stop, but in the spirit of advocating for what we believe, I'll close with this. Jesse Speaks had a very interesting post that kind of aligns with what Charlie Kirk was saying, and I'll just read an excerpt of it. He said that he was writing about Tom Holland, who's not a preacher, he's not a pastor, isn't even a Christian apologist. He's a secular historian, but he had this to say. Holland argued that Christianity didn't merely influence Western ethics, it rewired them. Ideas that we now treat as obvious: human dignity, the value of the weak, moral equity, compassion as virtue, were not moral defaults in the ancient world. They were revolutionary claims born at the foot of the cross. What Holland's conclusion, what makes it so disruptive, is that it exposes a contradiction. Modern secular ethics fiercely reject Christianity while quietly living off of its moral capital. Concepts like human rights, equality, and care for the marginalized did not emerge from atheism or pagan philosophy. They are Christian claims stripped of their source and rebranded as self-evident truths. And he closes saying, you don't have to worship Jesus to live in a world shaped by him, but you can't pretend that the world wasn't built on his cross. Christianity didn't just change beliefs, it changed what humans mean by good.
yeah. Tom Holland, he wrote the book Dominion, which talks about this, and it's a phenomenal book. It's a very thick book, but it's, as you said, not a believer, but he came to the conclusion of just doing the research. It's a very good book. We can maybe talk about that as maybe a topic later on, but yeah, very well said. Very good summmy.
Amen. Well, thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
Thanks for
You too.
being
Thanks
a
for the
part of it
research
today.
on this, and yeah, thanks for looking into all the details. It was really good. I learned a ton from it, so hopefully the listeners do as well.
And thank you again to the listeners who asked the questions that sparked this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Marcus. God bless.
See you next time, brother. God bless.
All right, man. See you.